Madam Web is here, and War Machine might finally be a real card. Let's go ahead and dive into our weekly Dex roundup for Marvel Snap and see how things are shaking out, shall we? We kick off my Jeff's picks this week with an updated take on Little Spectrum featuring not only Madam Web, but our new ongoing War Machine as well. These two cards, initially getting powered up by Spectrum, also allow this archetype to play Ebony Maw as a 1/7 ongoing threat. War Machine lets us play Ebony Maw in the later turns of the game or play other cards directly into its path despite its typical drawback, and Madam Web lets us slide things into the Ebony Maw path, giving us two different ways to add stats in addition to Miss Marvel and Spectrum to the path that Ebony Maw would typically be locking out. This deck list also gets to play a variety of incredibly disruptive cards like US Agent, Cosmo, and Armor that are all extra potent when combined with Madam Web, since cards always move at the very start of a turn regardless if you have priority or not, basically letting you threaten Cosmo in every lane simultaneously so long as it resides in Madam Web's path at the start of the turn. As far as higher series cards go, I do think Madam Web, Miss Marvel, and Machine are pretty important for this deck to punch at an appropriate weight class. I think Speed you could substitute for another 3 energy ongoing card like Punisher or Captain America, and US Agent is serviceable in exchange for Goose if it's lacking in your collection. My second Jeff's pick this week is my current favorite iteration of the Bounce archetype. Since Silver Sable was added to the game last week, I've been favoring playing a whopping 6 1 energy cards, which not only makes Wiccan hyper consistent at being activated, but it also makes Falcon and Beast a lot more potent at consistently bouncing a variety of cards back to our hand so we can get their effects again and again and again. This deck list really feels like it's in a good spot in the metagame, with Sandman getting nerfed in our most recent OTA, which in tandem with Wiccan giving us extra energy means that even on the final turn, we can play out a few cards through Sandman's new, more limited drawback. As far as higher series cards go in this deck list, Hitmonkey and Kitty Pryde I think are the two that are absolutely non-negotiable. Others have reasonable swaps. Kate Bishop could substitute for something like Angela. Silver Sable and Nico Minaro could be other 1 energy cards that like bouncing back and forth between your hand and play. And even Wiccan can substitute out for a different enabler on the last turn of the game, such as Black Swan. Moving on to our high potential category, we have new deck lists that have promising metrics and albeit small sample size on the Untapped tracker so far. We kick off with a Marvel Boy, War Machine, Pixie Madam Web amalgamation. There's a ton of different things going on here, but we see it leveraging this same Ebony Maw, Madam Web, War Machine package that the Spectrum ongoing list I enjoy features as well. This deck list also has a small lockout sub theme with Storm, since she is essentially one-sided with Madam Web and War Machine letting you slide things into her lane after the fact, and Pixie lets this deck list leverage a variety of heavy hitters at the top end, often surprising your opponent with how many points you're going to be putting out in that important final turn of the game. As far as higher series replacements go, I would wager Alioth can substitute out for other 6 energy plays like Red Hulk or Magneto, and Nebula is likely interchangeable for other good 1 energy cards such as Iceman. Our next high potential deck list features Agatha Harkness for the first time ever in one of these best decks roundups. Her change in the Over There update makes it so she only controls your even costed turns now. This potentially makes her a pretty real Marvel Snap card. The way this deck is constructed, if you control turn 3, you play out Moon Knight, Lady Sif, or Wave to essentially remove Agatha Harkness from the equation to let you gain control over the game in its entirety, but also have started up with a free 6 energy 14 power card in your hand. That's one of the really potent things that Agatha does. She's different from a card like Quicksilver in that she's an additional card in your opener, not something that's taking up one of your draws. This deck list is actually incredibly budget friendly, with Black Knight being the only must-have higher series cards, making sure that you get value out of your Agatha consistently. Silver Sable as well as Legion can trade out for other cards at a similar energy cost, so long as you're making sure that they are odd, so that way Moon Knight is hitting your Agatha Harkness as consistently as possible. Our next high potential deck list is one of the only Madam Web movement decks putting up reasonable stats on Untapped so far. I think this deck list is doing two things in particular that are notable compared to others that I've looked at. The first is that it's leveraging Cosmo as a way to not only get out in front of disrupting decks that are looking to combo you with Wong, but also to protect your own cards against opposing interaction like Shadow King, Shang-Chi's, and even occasionally Killmongers looking to blow away the giant sandcastle that this deck is building. Second is that this deck list has a small bounce package in Falcon, letting it reuse its ones, which is also pairing with Black Swan to make them free going into the last turn of the game, so you can redeploy Human Torch and friends alongside Heimdall to make a big swing that's difficult for your opponent to predict. Our last high potential deck list is doing some toxic lockdown things. The basic idea here is relatively straightforward. You play cards out early like Nebula, Hydra Bob, and Makari. You then play Storm on turn 3, War Machine on turn 4, and then you Legion the Flooded Path with War Machine's effect on turn 5, effectively ending the game a turn early where you still get to play out on turn 6, but your opponent does not unless they have a War Machine of their own. Moving along to our top performing decks this week, we kick off with a couple of the usual suspects, starting with Khazar Gilgamesh Zoo. Couple of noteworthy inclusion this established archetype this week is that Silver Sable looks to be finding herself playable as a 1 energy inclusion, and this particular list, which was the best performing by a solid margin in the early untapped stats, is notably leveraging Cosmo, which I assume is similar to what we saw in the Madam Web movement deck from earlier, as a way to not only proactively stop disruption from your opponent targeting your stuff, but also shutting down decks like Wong that would typically go way over the top of the stats that the Zoo deck is able to put into play. Our next top performer is Tried and True Collector Discard. This archetype has just been consistently putting up strong metrics in Marvel Snap for a number of months now. We're also not playing really any new cards or doing anything particular fancy. If you're looking for a really consistent Marvel Snap deck, this is a great choice for that. Our last top performing deck this week is Clog. The build that we have on your screen is near and dear to my particular heart. It's one that I worked on stream and has also been putting up solid metrics on Untap both before and after this most recent OTA, but it's worth acknowledging that there's lots of different builds of this deck which are finding success based on early Untap stats that we have. The regulars here will note that I don't have any most popular decks in this week's roundup, and that's because in the early metrics after the OTA at Untapped so far, there isn't a single archetype that's getting even close to having double-digit percentage representation, so it didn't feel right to call out anything in particular as being most popular when the format so far is looking really diverse with lots of different things that you can play to success. As always, I would love to hear which decks you're having fun and finding success with in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed my recommendations, be sure to snap that like button to help this video reach some more people, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of my other Marvel Snap game news updates and weekly deck roundups here all the time.